Yeah. Okay, we're going to get started now with the finale ultimo, an intimate interview with Patrick Byrne. Who knows, it is a Saturday night, and I'm sure Patrick is loaded. I know all of you are, so why don't we'll start talking. And I guess, Patrick, my first question, I think you spoke eloquently and, inarguably about the way, not only the need for school choice, but the way to get it done. Here's a question for you. You talked about Milton and Rose Friedman. You're the chair of the Milton and Rose Friedman, or the Friedman Foundation for Education. How did you first encounter Milton and Rose's work? What was the context for that? And were they your gateway into a kind of libertarian worldview?
Actually, it was oddly enough, in 1984, I was living in the north of Thailand in a little house by a refugee camp that in the 60s, some people from the American military and early 70s had lived there. And there wasn't much to do, but there was a stack of Time or Newsweeks and such in the garage. And I was reading these, so I started reading through the stack, and I found these essays by Milton Friedman, who I'd heard of in my college economics classes, but not studied closely. And his essays made such impeccable sense to me. And that's when I first really started getting, exposed to his thinking, just these popular essays.
So you were reading years old Newsweek columns.
Right.
Yeah, that's great.
And then I came back and I finished up and I did a minor in economics at Dartmouth. And I was also doing philosophy in the standard dose of philosophy. And it wasn't until I was well into my PhD program that I realized, a lot of the stuff that I'm learning in political philosophy, John Rawls and stuff, is fundamentally inconsistent. It was like I thought I was studying two different subjects, and I gradually put it together that it was really quite inconsistent. I had to choose sides. Yeah. And then I saw Milton on a cable at Stanford. He did they called it local access when you have local access TV. I saw him do a talk on school choice in the Stanford community. And people came in loaded for bear, of course. And if you ever saw Milton Friedman in a debate, it was like watching a little Aikido master flipping people around. And these folks would come in from a very statist intellectual community in general and try to debate him. And he was invariably gentle and polite and ran circles around people. And I'll never forget, my pop and I watched that local access TV that night, and I think we both decided then, if there's one thing that would make an enormous difference for America, it's fixing the educational system. So that's really where it got going. And then Cato, Ed Crane at Cato, came by one time in around 2000, came by Utah and met me, and we had lunch, and then I told him about my great admiration for Milton Friedman, and he said, well, Milton and I are old friends, let me arrange a meeting. And we met, and that's how our relationship started.
Okay, here's a harder question, and one of the earlier questions after your talk was from one of my fellow Reason colleagues, and this one is from another one who's here tonight. But should the state be involved in education, or is that a second best option? Or can you make the case that education is a public good or should be supplied by the state?
Well, Milton did speak of ideally someday maybe we'd get more education at a lower cost if it ultimately was completely private and you bought education for your kids just like you bought shingles for your roof and it was completely private. I think that there is some argument. I think it's the kind of thing that when in doubt, you want to be a little bit cautious with. And rather than leave things that entirely to the private market, we want to, it's a bit paternalistic to say, no, you have to educate the children, you don't get a choice about that, but to leave the form of education up to the parents, I think that's a good, healthy step. And if we took that step, let another 50 years go by and then start thinking about the next step.
What was your favorite subject growing up? When you were in K through 12, did you have a particular intense interest in history or literature or economics? Or?
Well, the subject at which I did best was math. Anything math was, frankly, was effortless. The things that interested me were history and literature.
Well, let's talk about Overstock. Overstock.com, your company. You've been on the cutting edge of a lot of different things, including using Bitcoin or taking Bitcoin, and we'll talk about that. I'm interested also in, you're one of the last, if not the last, big retailer, internet retailer who is really kind of balls out against internet sales tax, against collecting state taxes. Talk a little bit about where that is and what has happened in an industry where one of the reasons why the internet flourished was because they didn't have to collect sales tax, and that gives a competitive advantage to the company but also to the consumer. Where are you on that?
Great question. Well, there was in 1991 or so, there was a case, a North Dakota company that sold office supplies or something, Quinn, was brought, sued in Illinois because they weren't collecting taxes. It got to the US Supreme Court, who decided in 1992, out-of-state retailers can't be forced to collect in-state taxes. And there were a number of arguments for that, not the least of which is the dormant commerce clause, I think it's called. In the Constitution, it says that the federal government Congress is empowered to regulate interstate commerce, which had for 2 centuries been interpreted to mean because the states were not able to, and taxation was one form of regulation. So that's how things stood. States got very hungry, of course. States are always hungry for revenue. So about 6 or 7 years ago, they got serious about collecting taxation on out-of-state retailers. It's quite an open question whether that's even constitutional, because what the U.S. Supreme Court said in it was the Quill decision. What they said in 92 was that a state can't do it individually, but Congress could. If Congress ever wants to revisit it, they could set up a system of how to tax out-of-state retailers shipping in-state. It's the political economy of it has been hilarious, because there's Amazon, who has built out a footprint in, last I heard, about 40 states. But they put their Delaware warehouse, they historically took the position, well, we don't own that. We put in a subsidiary called the Amazon Delaware Warehouse Corporation, so we don't really have any operations in Delaware, so we're not going to collect tax. And that's what they've done across the country. Which was a very aggressive tax position for Amazon to take. That tax position crumbled beneath them in the last few years. And so now that they have warehouses in all these different states, they have essentially become a big box retailer. Only their big boxes aren't stores, they're warehouses. Given that it's now going to happen anyway, and we meanwhile have been super careful about keeping our only employees are in Utah. And we've been very, very careful about that. So I think we have some in Pennsylvania now, we have some in Chapel Hill as well. But we've generally been very, very, and we pay taxes in those states. But we thought Amazon's was an extraordinarily aggressive tax position. Well, they reached the point that now they have warehouses in, say, 40 states. That's kind of a laughable position. So they've switched sides. But they're switching sides. It's really just to try to say, well, since we're going to have to pay tax, we want Overstock and eBay to have to pay tax too. The states have gotten around the Quill decision by saying, well, if you have a marketing relationship with what's called an affiliate marker online, that counts as having an operation in our state, so you have to collect. Now you have physical nexus.
And so this is any time a blogger is an Overstock affiliate where they get a percentage of sales through their site, that means you're in that state.
And so, correct. And so every time a state passes those laws, we cut off, we fire. There's thousands of people around the country who make their living with these affiliate marketing programs. We and the other major retailers, we just fire them, and it's a shame. And every time they pass one of these laws, hundreds of people get fired in these different states. Colorado passed a law a couple years ago that so it's at a constitutional level, it's quite questionable. The New York Supreme Court has upheld New York's decision that they were going to do this. But of course, we ended by just ending our relationships with the people in their states who do that. And by the way, it's kind of specious because, you know, if somebody said, if we take out an ad in the LA Times, does that mean we have physical nexus in California? Don't think so. But why is it that if some blogger in California, we pay for him to put a link on his site to us, now we have physical nexus in California? But anyway, so anytime a state does it, we end the relations. Colorado passed an interesting version of this called a notice, where they said we had to notify any Colorado consumer who buys from us. At once a year, we have to tell them, hey, by the way, you Colorado consumer, you owe your state X amount of tax that you were supposed to pay, but that you're supposed to have paid because you bought from us. It's a use tax, and we were supposed to give Colorado a list of everybody in Colorado who bought from us and how much they bought. So now Colorado can make sure they ding them, which I don't feel so comfortable providing any government the list of their citizens. Last week, the United States Supreme Court overturned the Colorado law, and Justice Kennedy, in his opinion, slipped in some language that more or less said, it's time this all gets brought, either Congress fix it or we, the Supreme Court, are going to get in and straighten this out.
What are the other regulatory issues that are bedeviling e-commerce?
Well, there's the whole net neutrality issue, which is net neutrality, which we were just talking about. You know, Netflix was, but I think the big issue is the Obama administration has, unsurprisingly, just applied a law that was supposed to regulate the telephone industry from the 1930s, and said now the federal government's going to regulate.
So last week the FCC ruled to classify internet service providers under Title II, which is or as a telecommunication service, which is the laws that date back to the 30s that allowed for and created the Bell telephone monopoly, essentially. Right. And the Obama administration was very aggressive in the FCC is supposed to be an independent agency, but the Obama administration laid out exactly what they wanted to happen, and the chairman, who had been against Title II, suddenly saw the light and flipped that way. So how will, well, let's talk a little bit about Overstock and your streaming services that you're talking about, and then how, why aren't you in favor of net neutrality? Because it seems like all of the, everybody who has a big internet presence, they want net neutrality. But talk about the streaming first, and then we'll talk about net neutrality.
Well, we announced a couple months ago down in Miami, there's a conference every year of all the people who produce content, television shows and movies, but especially television, and all the people who buy television shows, i.e. the networks and so on and so forth, meet once a year in Miami at a conference called NATB, the North American Television Production Executive, something or other. And they meet and handle and swindle each other and so forth. Great conference, a lot of fun, a lot of great people. The entertainment industry is new and foreign to me, but they're fun people to work with. And what's happened is a lot of companies sprung up, got funding, and created very interesting technology, but they're being shunted out by the big three, by Amazon, Apple, and Google Android. And so there are these wonderful technologies, but they can't get any traffic to their sites. And what we're finding is ways to integrate with them. So we'll have a content tab, I hope, sometime this summer, knock on wood, that says that we'll have TV shows and movies and books and music. And it will be device agnostic in a way that, say, the iTunes stuff and the other three is not. So that's our deal. But for us, why don't you explain net neutrality to people?
Well, many of you are probably familiar with it, but it's the idea that the internet should be maintained free and open through a set of rules that would be enforced by the government that wouldn't allow internet service providers to block access to legal sites or to throttle traffic on something like Netflix, and that it is, that there are no real instances of this happening, but it could happen, or where you could pay extra to have your material get to somebody's web browser first, things like that. And that this is seen as a violation of kind of the foundational principles of the web, so there should be a law against it.
And I just don't share that intuition. Now, it is the case that Netflix, for example, I understand on a typical weekday evening, something like 40% of the traffic of the packets on the internet are Netflix. So arguably, if you're one of the internet service providers, what do you want to do? There's basically two ways to ration a scarce good, either by making people wait or making people pay. And the natural order of things, allegedly, would be the ISPs would start saying, you know what, Netflix, we're going to charge you a little bit more to carry your packets because we have these finite, pipes, and we got to do something to throttle you. And then that cost, Netflix would have to pass on, or it would eat into their profit margins and so forth. So that's what the gods of economics want to see happen. But that differential pricing, net neutrality, says you can't do that, ISP. Well, I think that if you enable them to do it, you ought to enable them to do it, and then you know what? Other technology, there would be innovation and other.
Earlier you were talking when we were talking about streaming and whatnot. That this, the fact that you're ready to go with a platform of streaming, it really undermines, or it's an example of where monopolies really crumble almost as soon as somebody seems to have market dominance. Talk a little bit about that principle, and also why it seems kind of obvious that monopolies don't last very long if they start stiffing their customers or if they can't be enforced by the government. So why are we constantly motivated to pass laws to prevent monopolies that only exist because of laws?
I think and you're right, a lot of the monopolistic practices exist because somebody gets big enough that they're able to buy their own regulators to help protect their monopoly. And so the government has a very mixed record in terms of whether they actually break monopolies or encourage monopolies. Let me give you an example. When I was a kid, I'm trying to find a way to sit that this doesn't bite into me. When I was a kid, there was a fight going on with IBM because between the Justice Department and IBM, it went on for 18 years because the Justice Department had decided that IBM had, by the mid-70s, they decided IBM had a lock on the computer industry. No one was ever going to be able to innovate in the computer industry because IBM had this lock. And of course, IBM made this wonderful decision, facetious. In 1984, IBM did this deal with Microsoft when they introduced the new PC in Microsoft. Everyone knows the story of DOS and QDOS and such. And IBM owned 35% of Microsoft as part of that deal. And then when Microsoft went public in around 86 or 87, some genius at IBM decided they were going to sell all their shares into the IPO. Why? Because they wanted to stay in that business of screwing the boards together, and they thought that's where the real money was going to be. They don't want to be in this icky software business. So IBM so they sold their third stake in Microsoft. And of course that turned out, it turns out all this soldering of the motherboards to the frame and stuff, you do that in Malaysia at $2 an hour, and that wasn't a good business decision of the executive at IBM. But that icky software business turned out to have a pretty good run. Microsoft, so then eventually the Justice Department dropped the case against IBM, and the 90s went after Microsoft to say, well, clearly Microsoft has a lock on the computer business, and no one's ever going to be able to touch Microsoft. It's got a stranglehold. It's invented. Well, Microsoft missed one turn. They missed search. And a couple guys, grad students at Stanford, figured out how to search, and thus came Google. And so now some people think that Google, or certainly a few years ago, people were saying, well, Google has this unbelievable lock. No one's ever going to be able to dislodge Google.
One of the weird things about antitrust actions, too, is that, all of the laws are written where it's supposed to be about the consumer. Like, does this help or hurt the consumer? But it always ends up being what company has market share, and it's always kind of a fight among companies. How do we, what's an educational process so that people understand kind of that, like empires, companies rise and fall. IBM had a great 70-year run or 100-year run. GM, same thing. Ford. what do we do to get people to start understanding that market forces actually are the greatest enemy of monopoly? They're not the conduit of it.
Well, something that I'm thinking of is George Orwell wrote an essay, I think it was called Notes on Burnham, about a guy named James Burnham. And I'm not familiar with his work, but he was an intellectual of whom Orwell wrote a story during World War II. And it was about how you could sort of pick whatever the direction of things was at that time. Burnham would write saying, well, this is going to go on forever this way. Then history would take a turn this way. When we first started losing the war, evidently Burnham was writing, well, it's obvious Europe's going to fall and everything's going to go this way. And then when it goes, it's this. And at every turn, so Orwell thought that there was a natural tendency for intellectuals to take whatever's happening in the moment and project it out indefinitely into the future because it makes them feel better that they spotted a trend faster than their buddies or something. And I think that's part of what's going on. Remember that the legal profession is filled with intellectual-like people, and they just think that they don't really seem to have in their fingertips. I've got a lot of friends in the legal profession, and they have a complete lack of feeling in their fingertips about the way these things work. And they're more like biological processes to me, and dynamics create counter dynamics, and they don't have any sense of that. So I don't know how you get people to see it better. There's a Epstein, Richard Epstein, you've interviewed, haven't you?
Richard Epstein, the great libertarian legal thinker who has changed the way that takings are considered by the Supreme Court.
That was a great, in fact, that was a seminal lecture in my life, seeing his lecture at Stanford on takings. He's done a lot in the law and economics movement to sort of critique the standard classical theory that underlies the government's belief about the need for them to fight monopolies. But I look at just this example I gave you of how IBM was on a good run, so the government assumed, oh my gosh, that's going to go on forever. Then they get totally disrupted by Microsoft, and then the government goes after them. Well, clearly, that's no one's ever. Then Google totally breaks the back of Microsoft because of search. And then I'm surprised the government hasn't gone after Google hard. Well, in Europe they have. They've gone after Google. But already there's, Google. I love Google, and they're great guys. I know guys at the company, and it's great company. I've learned a lot from the folks at Google and how they organize. There's a lot to be studied there, but I don't think they have a lock on anything. Amazon, Twitter, look at how much people get now from Twitter, what you used to get through search. Amazon has now surpassed Google as of last quarter for the first time in product searches. People are going to Amazon to search for products to find on the internet more than they go to Google to do it. But the folks in the legal profession, I think they're like this guy, James Burnham, whose work I don't know, that just they look at whatever's happening now and they think, well, that's got to go on forever.
It's a straight line extrapolation. Which
Trees don't grow to the sky.
I'm sorry to learn, I gained 2 pounds today, so, by the end of the year, I'm going to be about 6,000 pounds if this continues, which may actually be true. So.
On Wall Street, they say trees don't grow to the sky.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's just people's...
Talk, okay, so here, we promised an intimate discussion. Let's talk more about what drives you. This, Patrick is one of the most interesting characters in the business world or in the policy world.
This coming from an interesting character.
But you wrote a PhD dissertation in philosophy on Robert Nozick. What was the subject, if you can remember, and what drew you to Nozick?
Well, it was Nozick and Rawls. It was kind of dancing around the era. When I was doing my doctorate, the sort of the 3 pillars within which the discourse was held was Nozick, Rawls, and Sandel. And I'd read Nozick over at Cambridge. What I was trying to do, I didn't really have the guts to say what I wanted to say, but I was deeply questioning. A guy named John Rawls at Harvard in 1972 or so wrote A Theory of Justice, and whole forests have been denuded for the paper to write the books and papers in response to John Rawls. And John Rawls is sort of the intellectual underpinning. The conventional interpretation is that's the philosophical, intellectual underpinning of what we now think of as the social welfare state of the Swedish model, or what we've
Right, and he talked about a veil of ignorance, where if you do a thought experiment and you imagine a system where things are kind of randomly distributed or just in very disparate ways, and if you didn't know where you would end up in that system, you would opt to kind of equalize things as much as possible.
Right, that if you got to choose the rules of society before you were born, and you're separated by this veil of ignorance, and you don't know if you're going to be rich or poor, white or black, male or female, etc., what are the rules that you think society should run by? And whatever you would choose would be rational for you to choose there. Those are the rules we should live by now. And the standard interpretation is that you would choose something like Sweden. Right. And what I was trying, that's kind of the church in which most of political philosophy, at least in my day, was done. You didn't argue, you didn't stray too far from that. And there had been feminist and Marxist reimaginings of this original position and saying, well, but if you know, Rawls is right, but if you knew everything we know now about the way male patrimony, the way patrimony oppresses women, you'd add in these codicils that are extra feminist, or it'd be like an extra feminist version of Sweden. And Marxists say, well, if you understood everything that we scientific Marxists have come to understand about society, you would go even further, because you've got to do things to disrupt instruments of oppression and this and that. And so it's like I had learned two different things. I was studying all this philosophy, but I was also studying all this economics and development economics and other economics. And so I said, well, let's think of it the same way. Suppose we get to run that original position, but with a knowledge of economics that is kind of absent, right? It is absent in Rawls's book. What you would end up with is not a Swedish model, but I don't think you can really get much beyond Nozick. Well, I don't think that you can get from a rights-based perspective to anything like what John Rawls said. So I left it off saying, if you believe in this stuff, it can only be from a utilitarian perspective, not from a people have rights to this, that, and the other thing, but from, well, if you're a utilitarian and you might argue that the Swedish model is that which creates the greatest the amount of happiness, but you can't get there can't convince me that it's through people have a right to housing, people have a right to, that those aren't rights, they're goods. And I think it's good that people have them, but you're not going to get there. There's been this whole effort, as we all know, to take what the left has fought for decades and say, to end the fight by saying people have a right to this. And actually, 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to say these are all rights that people have. And I think that's a particularly pernicious way to think of these things. They're not rights, they're goods. And if they're goods, we can talk about how to produce them and how to get people to have the most of them and the best of them at the lowest price and all that stuff. But once you come in and throw a blanket over it all and say these are rights, you just sort of, to me, the kind of intelligent conversation ends, and it just...
And I mean, Nozick is famous. A couple of people today had quoted Nozick in talking about a utopia of utopias, which is, a kind of great libertarian idea. It's almost applying freedom of religion or religious practice to all aspects of human activity. You were talking about school choice. I mean, I think it's really kind of interesting that, one great argument that you're making for school choice is you don't have to get into issues about what should schools be teaching or what's the common curriculum or anything, because you let all sorts of things happen. What do you do with the experiments in this that go horribly wrong?
Well, I saw, and by the way, I don't mean to give short thrift to Nozick. I love Nozick. Yeah. Anarchy, State, and Utopia, which I read over in Cambridge, which my Don over there, wonderful gal, a wonderful woman, Susan James, I think gave me to sort of inoculate me against it. I read it and I thought, gee, this is much more convincing than John Rawls, and it has the great advantage of being written, it's lucid and clear, and you never read a paragraph that you don't, and that's a common denominator of have you ever noticed the pro-freedom people, like Milton or Nozick, they write, and it's crystal clear what it is they're trying to say, and as opposed to the people we're up against. They write, and it's this crepuscular grammars, and I think the obvious, your first guess as to why they do it that way is the correct guess. It's all just to obfuscate. I'm sorry, go back to your...
Well, I mean about the utopia of utopias and
what do you
school
do with
choice.
the schools?
I mean, what do you do with the experiments that, the experiments in living that go horribly wrong?
I saw Milton and Rose. I sat with them while some New York paper interviewed them, and if you knew them, and by the way, Milton wasn't just being polite. Rose was his intellectual equal, and that may have understated it. She was sharp and aggressive while he tried to be gentle with people. So if he was the Aikido master, she was the Doberman. And so the journalist asked him a question about that. What do you do with the problem of madrasas? If you have school choice, what are you going to do? And Milton gave a very careful answer about that. And when it was all, went on for 3 or 4 minutes, when it was all done, Rose said, and by the way, this country can survive a few madrasas. It's that simple. We can survive a few madrasas. And, theoretically, are you going to send your kid to a madrasa? And if there is some madrasa, and I use that metaphorically for all kinds of ways.
A school we don't like.
A school we don't like, or teaching, fascism or something. Although I'm not sure I wouldn't, it's going to be hard for them to imagine, it's going to be hard for me to imagine they're having good test scores, that they're teaching fascism, or they're teaching, that allegedly there are Christian schools that teach, whenever I talk about this at universities, people say, well, what about those Christian schools that teach that human beings rode around on the back of dinosaurs? What do you do about them? Well, I'm not actually sure there are such schools, because I've looked for that example and I can't find. I hear a lot of people asking that question and writing about their schools. I can't find the actual schools. But if they did, my guess is their kids wouldn't be doing so well on SATs anyway. And so other parents are going to start saying, gee, just like you're not going to give your patronage to a local restaurant, which is serving bad food, that it's not going to draw, those kinds of schools are going to go bankrupt. And in the school choice movement, there is an argument, there are those, among the people who sort of oppose it, there are those who say, well, if you're going to let schools do this, they have to test their kids and publish the results of the test in aggregate. And I'm not sure, of course, on principle, I'm against any sort of government interference, but I could live with that. Just like I can live with that there is a government agency that says if you sell a can of peas, you have to have a label on it describing the contents. I think it's okay to say, I would certainly accept it as a compromise to say, okay, there can be these private schools taking vouchers, but they test their kids and they have to report each year the progress on tests and how much kids improve before, things like that. So parents, it would help them make informed choices. And I could live with that. And I think if you had that, you're going to find that the madrasas and the schools that allegedly teach kids, humans rode around on dinosaurs would die out.
Well, as somebody who watched a lot of Flintstone reruns, I'm pretty sure that humans did ride around on dinosaurs.
Right.
Well, let's talk about some of your particular great interests. You like skydiving, and you were talking, in a single month, you jumped 55 times out of a plane. Obviously, you survived each of them. How did you get into skydiving, and what's the thrill of that?
Well, 30 years ago, I used to skydive. I used to drop out, go down to Zephyr Hills, Florida, and live in a rented school bus that was up on cinder blocks for $20 a month. And I was just part of that subculture that you see depicted in Point Break, and just lived. My business.
So you're also a bank robber?
Well, no.
Wearing a dead president's mask or an ex-president mask.
But you can live there on francs and beans, and I could and be totally off the grid and spend a week at a time, and it was great. So in between different things I did, business projects and other things, I would just sort of drop out and live in there or camp in upstate New York and such, and do that. Well, I gave it, the guy who taught me to skydive in, it was about early 90s. I went back and jumped with him, and he taught me what's called a pro pack. It used to be that your chute would open and opens with a jolt, and your straps dig into you and it really hurts. But once you got good, you could learn to pack your chute so it opened with sort of a slow crumble, and it was called a pro pack, and it gave you not such a jolt. So we packed our chutes next to each other that time, and Frank Piagnelli, as I recall his name was, and he showed me fold by fold how he packed his chute, and I was doing mine. We did it. We went up and jumped. My chute opened beautifully, and his tangled up. And so I watched this guy from above, and he got in a, I forget what it's called. It's like being on a carousel where you're spinning, and he finally cut away at about 800 feet, popped his reserve, and he walked away from it. And I went and I jumped one more time, just because you always have to get back on the horse, and then I hung up my spurs, and I didn't jump again. So I didn't jump again until this year. Overstock's building a new campus, and it'll be open next August, say in 15 months, 16 months, and you folks will dig this. It's a $100 million, we have 900 people in each of 2 locations in Salt Lake, but 15 miles apart. So between the 2, we found a location that is, that we're building a $100 million campus that's right on the approach path of 22 million passengers who come and land at Salt Lake. And what I love about it, from the side, it's a corporate glass and steel version of the Roman Colosseum. But from above, it's a giant peace sign. And building a $100 million peace sign.
And you said this is also, it's near the NSA giant base.
It's just north of it's just a few miles north from that. You could fire a bullet from the NSA. I mean, we'll look right down 3 miles to this Bluffdale NSA facility that who the heck knows what they're building there. And so there was the grand opening on October 10th, the groundbreaking on October 10th, and all these poobahs from Utah came, and politicians and such, crowd of 1,500 people or more. And around this big, they already bulldozed out the footprint of this giant O. And of course, coincidentally, it's a giant O, but it's going to be an O peace sign. And the central hub is sort of a central dining facility. It's going to be great, a great epic building. But with all these people there, I jumped in from 18,000 feet. So I had to, since it had been 25 years since I had jumped, I had to go and get my B license and get tuned up for this. So that's why I went and jumped in September and early October. I jumped 55 times. I jumped into the middle of this.
The stock would have really tanked, right, if that went wrong. If you even missed the building, much less hurt yourself. You're also a black belt in Taekwondo and something else as well, or?
Well, I did a lot of Hapkido and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Never got the black belt.
How did you? What got you into that, and what's the thrill of that?
I'm the youngest and smallest of 3 sons, and my two brothers. So I grew up. My 2 brothers, were playing tennis and golf and things like that. But I basically grew up getting my butt whipped by my big brothers. And so they thought they were toughening me up, the boy named Sue kind of stuff. So all I ever wanted to do since I was a kid was learn, my sports were wrestling, boxing, karate, wherever we lived, those are the only sports, and they come very natural to me, to be honest. I don't know why. Everything else feels learned, but I can close my eyes and just wrestle forever. I just love wrestling, grappling, and so forth. And then this funny thing happened in about 19. You want me to tell you a funny story?
Yes.
Am mind if I tell a little digression here? I was a student in Cambridge in 88 to 90, and there was I swear, and this is the kind of thing that somebody will pick up and on the internet write these blogs. There's 2 guys who have written over 10,000 blogs about what a bad guy is and no one should listen. And they both are sponsored by Wall Street. And there's a reason Wall Street has it. I mean, it's kind of an odd hobby to write 10,000 blogs about why a guy and no one should listen. But so one of them will be writing about this, I'm sure. I was a student in Cambridge, and there was a Playboy article about this martial artist in America who was challenging all comers. And I had heard about him and I think it's the only time in my life I ever bought a Playboy, but I bought a Playboy to read this article. His name was Horian Gracie. And the martial arts community in America was really ticked off that this guy had shown up from Brazil and was saying, look, I can fight anybody and I can beat anybody, any boxer or anything. And but he had choreographed the movie Lethal Weapon, and I had seen Lethal Weapon and had been particularly impressed because that is, fights never actually go like they do in the movies where somebody does a beautiful spinning butterfly kick and that never happens. Fights are always two guys end up on the ground pounding each other, and I knew that much by then. So I read this article, and it was an interview with him where he was very matter-of-fact about it, that he could beat anyone in the world. So I wrote him a letter. I said, no disrespect, Mr. Gracie, but I'm a wrestler and a boxer, and I'd love to, challenge you. I mean, I'm not...
So you were really trying to do anything but your graduate work, right? You're like writing letters to press. I'll take you on.
Only so much Rawls and Sandel. Okay. I could read Nozick all day, but not... So I wrote him this letter, and he wrote me this very polite, it was a very polite, respectful, not like, hey, I challenge you, but it was like, hey, please, it'd be my honor if I could come and fight you sometime. He wrote me back, oh, it's very nice, and sure, if you're ever in Los Angeles, look me up. So a couple years later, I found myself, I had a teaching fellowship at Stanford, but I had finished my classwork, and I moved down to Torrance, California. And I called this guy and I said, so remember me from 2 years ago? Oh yeah, come on in Tuesday afternoon at 3, we'll fight, we'll roll. I said, oh, that's great. Well, I go in, this was 1990, I guess. Actually, I tried to get in the Army, and I got rejected at the MEPS for medical reasons. And so, but I'd already kind of withdrawn from Stanford, trying to figure out what to do, and I just needed someplace to go and write my dissertation. So I drove down to California, and I go in and so he says, come in Tuesday at 3, we'll roll. I go in, and so it turns out that these guys, there were 4 brothers, and they were like carbon copies of each other. One, but if you'd set it on reduce. So one was about 220, and then there was one that was about 200, and then there was one that was about 170, and then there was one that was about 130. Their names were Hickson Gracie, Horian Gracie, Hoist Gracie, and Hoyler Gracie. And if those names mean anything to you now, no one had ever heard of these people back then. And I go in, and just the little 130-pound guy was there. And at the time, I was bigger than I was like, I'm 230, solid as heck. And so I had 100 pounds on this guy. And I go in, and the guy says, oh, yeah. The little 130-pound guy's there. He says, oh, yeah, my brother told me you'd be coming in. He said we were to go in and roll. I said, I don't mean any disrespect, but Hoyler, but I think I've got 100 pounds on you. I don't want to hurt you or anything. And he said, oh, that's funny. Yeah, we go in, you try not to hurt me. We go in, and there's like this padded room with wrestling mats on the walls. I'd never seen a dojo like this. We go in, and I found out why there were padded mats on the walls, because I spent an hour getting thrown upside down, smashed, and I moved up the street to some really fleabag motel on Crenshaw Avenue, and spent the next 2 months, just 2 or 3 months with them, and then for 3 years, I trained with them for about 3 years. Any moment I could, I'd go back to LA and train with them, and we became great friends. And the last time I saw them, this guy, Hoist Gracie, tested me. And he said, and we had become great friends, and he said, if you can last 3 minutes with me, I'll give you a black belt. And I would have been their first black belt. And I said, if I can last 3 minutes with you, Hoist, what about if I beat you? And he's like, oh, buddy, that's funny. Yeah, if you beat me, you see this black belt, buddy, you take this home with you. And so we went. Of course, I lasted about 2 minutes. And anyway, but the last time I was there, some guy came in with a business plan for a new league he was going to create. It would be like a box. See, we were doing all this fighting. SEALs would come in, Marines, the LA County sheriffs, and they'd want to be trained. And it was like not a bit. It was like Fight Club, but it was all being videotaped, but you had to hide the videotapes. It was wildly illegal. And it was certainly undefined in some states, but it really was like Fight Club. But, and it was hilarious, because guys would come in, some, black belt in Kung Fu, come in with 20 students being real jerks about it. Big guy saying, we're here to challenge you. And the 2 little Gracie guys would be like, oh man, you got to fight last time. Let me take him this time. And if anyone could last 30 seconds with one of these cats, it was like unbelievable. So some guy had this business plan for, let's create a league that'd be like a boxing league, but it would be martial arts, but you go into a ring and there's not rules and stuff like that, and they'd call it UFC. And I read this and I said, gee, this looks like a pretty good idea, Horan. Yeah. And of course, USC went on, has become this big, and I understand these guys, I don't follow it, but I understand Horace Gracie has become this sort of mythical figure, and Horan.
Yeah, mixed martial arts and UFC is like replacing boxing, really, as like the premier fight sport.
Right.
So, to switch gears a little bit, though, you're also a Buddhist, right? So you're a warrior, you're a Buddhist, you're a skydiver, you're a businessman. I know I'm in love. I don't know about the rest of you, but so what is the appeal of Buddhism, and how did you get into that?
Well, I grew up a devout Catholic. I was an altar boy and all that stuff. Around age 15, I was an altar boy until I was about 14, which is quite old to be an altar boy. I came, ended up...
like, even Menudo, like has a younger cutoff age, right? Than
I was kind of and I became convinced when I was about 8 years old that I was the reincarnation of a Shaolin monk. Nick picked up right away. I was watching too many episodes of Kung Fu. And I became, it seemed more, to be honest, I'm sure my instincts are quite, owe a lot to my Catholic upbringing, my instincts about my duties to the world and such. But my spiritual instincts really are more in tune with the Eastern. The idea that I don't, you're asking me about religion, so you're risking that I offend somebody. I don't mean to offend anybody's religions or anything, but the Western dualist view that you're here and God's there, and if you follow these rules, you might get to go there and meet him and stuff, that just doesn't strike any chord with me. But the Eastern approach, that it's about self-cultivation and that's the spiritual path that appealed to me more and seemed more natural to me. And so I started off with Buddhism, then I got into Taoism, and those of you who know your Eastern history know that Buddhism mixed with, the outer trappings of Buddhism were brought over from India, and they mixed with this philosophy of Taoism, who may have been, incidentally, the first libertarian. You ever read, the Tao Te Ching, the ruler who does the least is the best ruler and all that stuff. And they mixed, and they formed a religion called Chan. And Chan, in Chinese, got taken to Japan, where Chan is pronounced Zen. So Zen, the real philosophical core of Zen is Taoism, and then the outer form is Buddhism. And so that's just the tradition that my sense of how the world works comes from that. My sense of what my duties are in the world probably owes more to that Catholic upbringing.
And you talk a little bit about your relationship with Warren Buffett. He... how did he kind of form your business sense, or also a sense of duty to the world? And I know at Reason we beat up on Warren Buffett. He at various times is pushing for certain things, certain government policies that will help his businesses and whatnot. But talk a little bit about what he taught you.
Well, Buffett's friend once said to me, Patrick, most people go through life trying to win the lottery once, and you won 2 lotteries the day you were born. You got your father, who was the Connecticut State Lottery, and you got your mother, who was the Irish Sweepstakes, and that fellow was correct. My father was an Air Force ROTC guy that sort of he was an actuary, and he moved around, and he got passed over for a job at the Travelers, and he was real ticked off.
At Travelers Insurance?
Okay. And he quit. I was about 14 years old. So my family lived the Horatio Alger dream. I mean, we started off, my parents were just poor grad students, but by the time I was 14, or by the time I was 10 or 11, my pop was an insurance executive, and he got passed over for a job when I was 13, I guess, and he got offered taking a company. He left Travelers. He got offered taking a company through bankruptcy, this little broken Southern insurance company that had gone from $60 a share to $1 a share. And he was hired to take it through bankruptcy. Oh. And it was called Geico. And we moved down to Maryland, and he was there about a month before he figured out there was a way to save this company. And he needed to recapitalize it and such. And he started, and it was about a month into it, and we had never had a new car. in our family's history. We had not had a new car, but we had put our order in for the first new car, a station wagon. My father got a call one day saying there's some guy in Nebraska who's buying up stock in the company and wants to meet you. So that guy flew in, and my father went down to meet him, and they sat up all night talking. And this story is recounted in a lot of different books and such, and Buffett has told the story. And in the morning, they sat talking to Don, and in the morning, Buffett went out and sank half his net worth into Geico at a couple of dollars a share. And my father came home and canceled the order for this new $6,000 station wagon and put it into Berkshire Hathaway at about $70 a share. Yeah. And it worked out quite well for both the Byrne family and the Buffett family. And Buffett started staying with us, and he really is my rabbi after my parents, and he's my rabbi. In fact, that's how I'll get calls from him. I'll tell Patrick his rabbi's calling, and I'll call. And he's been my rabbi for my whole life. And he taught me an awful lot about, what he taught me about business is a thimble in the bucket of what he's taught me about life. Now, which isn't to say he agrees with everything I do, and I think he's probably figured out, well, we both figured out along the way, we have some different DNA. He's a gentle guy. I will never outgrow my sort of working class Irish, I don't like bullies, and I find myself in various fights, like with Wall Street. I figured out what Wall Street was. It's funny, Fortune magazine went through a story about how crazy I was, and then this big quote from me. This was November 2005. What a jerk this guy is, because I said in 2005, in front of a big business school class at Columbia, somewhere in America, there's grandmas eating dog food for dinner tonight, so some asshole on Wall Street can drive a Porsche. Well, Fortune ran that like, what a nut job. That goes in the bucket of saying the SEC is in bed with Wall Street. How can that be? Well, it's become obvious. These guys are predators, and they have figured out ways to loot the savings of America. So I tend to do some things that Buffett wouldn't. I'm a bit more, a lot of things. I'm more bare knuckle than he would be. But he's got to a place in life where he doesn't, and I know he gets a bad rap from some people in our community. Buffett broke with the Republican Party. His father was a senator from Nebraska, of the Robert Taft kind of senator, Howard Buffett, and he was a real isolationist, John Birch senator. And in the early 60s, Buffett broke with the Republican Party over civil rights. Now, I've pointed out to Mr. Buffett that the 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed with a liberal Democrat, Hubert Humphrey, and working with the Republican Party, and it was the Democrats who were against it. He says, yeah, but the champions of the civil rights were the Democrats. But anyway, it was civil rights that broke him away from the Republicans. I just saw a week or two ago, Buffett for the first time saying in an interview, I think CNBC, and I don't know why he goes on, I wish he wouldn't go on CNBC. CNBC, by the way, has a fax machine, and they get fax instructions from they're pets of a certain small number of hedge funds. There's the hedge funds who are the crooked ones who've been indicted and such, like Stephen Cohen. They take their instructions about what to say over a fax machine from these hedge funds.
Have you seen that fax machine?
I have seen the fax machine, and I have a very highly placed source in CNBC who has told me this. And as a journalist, I can't reveal who it is, but...
Well, you can.
Well, I won't.
Yeah. Magicians don't tell their tricks, but journalists tell everything.
But yeah, they do. You can't. But it reminds me of Buffett says, if you ever sit down at a poker table and in 15 minutes you haven't figured out who the pigeon is, you're the pigeon. Yeah. Well, if you're getting your information from CNBC, you're just getting information that hedge funds have told them to push out there so they can then, so they're trading ahead of it. It's a big, Jim Cramer's a crook. He's part of my base. Anyway, I digress. Anyone here see that Comedy Central takedown of Jim Cramer when Jon Stewart did that thing? I supplied them that video, and Jim Cramer knows it. I've been banned for life on CNBC. In fact, I used to go on all the time. but I was banned for life. I wrote an article about Jim Cramer once. I have a site called Deep Capture, which is all about Wall Street and my investigations into Wall Street. And I have a bunch of professional journalists and hackers and people like that who work. And we were it won all these awards in '08 as like the best investigative journalism in America on business, the best blog on business, all kinds of stuff. But I wrote a long story on Jim Cramer explaining both that he's a crook and his ties to organized crime. And I'm quite proud of the day his producer called me up and said, the story you wrote on Jim Cramer is the single meanest thing I've ever read in my life, and you're banned for life on CNBC. And it's funny, because about a year ago, Becky Quick and those other guys on television challenged me. Oh, we want Patrick Byrne on to come on this. And within an hour, I accept. Anytime, anywhere, I'll come on. It's live show only. Come on. And they won't even respond. And I ran into Becky Quick recently. They will not have me on CNBC, although I'm on Fox.
So is it safe to say that CNBC won't be on the content tab on Overstock.com?
No, that is safe to say.
Okay. Well, why don't we open it up for a couple of questions from the audience if people have a question for Patrick. Anyone?
I see somebody who's wanting to. This gentleman
come
here.
on up
Go
here.
ahead. Fire one ready.
Yeah, here. I should get up, but it's kind of late.
So I know it's still early in the game for your plans, but I did read that you had plans for blockchain technology and trying to use it to do stock market-like things with the blockchain. And I wonder if you had any comments on it, or if it's too early to comment on maybe even just the ideas, because I don't know if you'd even be developing an alpha at this point, but it's mainly about how to do it and your ideas on that.
Yeah, that'd be great. And also talk a little bit about why, Overstock was a real early adopter of Bitcoin. What's the appeal of that and of blockchain technology?
Well, the great appeal, and I heard Jeffrey talking about the change, the big change that's coming. I don't know if he's going to be talking about it tomorrow. I don't know if it's the same thing. For 5,000-6,000 years of human history, we've always faced a choice. We can have peer-to-peer exchange, or peer-to-peer exchange, but then trust becomes a factor. I'm trading you a camel for this gold coin, but how do I know you haven't debased the gold coin? Or we can have a centralized institution where we all don't have to trust each other, but each of us just has to trust it, and we have centralized institutions that we trust. Well, and that's always been the fundamental choice we make in how society gets organized. And of course, Agorians, I suppose some of us are called, think that actually the peer-to-peer is a better way to go. And the real problem with centralized institutions is they get captured. And so an example of a centralized institution is on the Oasis, whoever can, or in the town or the empire, who has the monopoly on the police power can say, you know what, I'll have a business model that says, we'll put out a gold coin, we'll stamp some guy's face on it, and anybody who debases it or cheats it, we'll kill him. That's just a business model. That's a way of monetizing their monopoly on the police power. It's a way of extracting their rent. So that's always the fundamental choice in organizational design of society. For the first time, 6,000 years of human history, we can have peer-to-peer exchange where trust is not a problem anymore. And it's through the technology that underlies Bitcoin. It's called the blockchain. That's the great innovation. And I see the historical and political ramifications of this invention as it's like 6,000 years up to this point, and then there's this. And it's just I think it's going to change everything, because we have all these legacy centralized institutions that are in one way or another have business models that are involved with saying, well, I'll solve the problem of trust among all you people, but in return for which I expect to get paid. And they've got various kinds of monopolies. And whether you're talking about central banking or at the heart of Wall Street, there's a centralized institution you never heard of called the DTCC. And it's the central clearing and settlement system of Wall Street. And what I got tuned into about 10 years ago was they had figured out ways organized crime has infiltrated the settlement system. And by the way, this isn't, I mean, you can go and look up the godfather of Russian organized crime is a guy named Semyon Mogilevich. He's into slavery and gun running and all the worst things in the world. But the thing that actually got him on the FBI most wanted list was his involvement in a market rigging scheme in a Philadelphia company called YBM Magnix. Look up Operation Uptick, the largest FBI sweep of the mafia in US history. They rounded up 120 mafiosis in one day, all scattered around Wall Street. For some reason, it still doesn't click for people. Organized crime has infiltrated Wall Street. If you've seen the movie Wolf of Wall Street, there's a dimension of that left out. That's called a boiler room, what the guy was running, Wolf of Wall Street. Every boiler room in the world is organized crime. The Gambinos and the Genoveses figured this out in the 90s, and organized crime deeply has infiltrated Wall Street. And the Genoveses brought Russian organized crime into the United States. They sponsored it like you might sponsor a family from Laos. They brought the Russian OC in. In 2009, Admiral Dennis Blair, the head of the Director of National Intelligence, said his greatest fear was there seemed to be all these signs that organized crime has infiltrated the financial system.
So can I ask just, and you're saying it's in the settlement, well, I mean, in a boiler room, so there's kind of like pump and dump schemes where they're building up stocks and then selling them before they crash at a peak. But then you're also saying in the clearinghouse of Wall Street at the end of the day when they're settling trades, what is going on? Like what are they rigging, or how are they?
It gets very technical. And I've spoken a lot about this. You can look on YouTube, look up my name and transnational organized crime. It's clear to me from reading the government cases, they understand pieces, but they didn't put all the pieces together. They've not put all the pieces together. But basically, think of it this way. We laugh at the Soviet Union for trying to run a society without property rights. But who here owns any stock in any publicly traded company? Raise your hand. Everyone with your hand up is wrong. None of you own any stock. All the stock in America is owned by a company you've never heard of called CD Incorporation. You're going to have to stop me if I back up too much. This system was invented in 1973. Until 1973, there were guys running around Wall Street with sacks, they were called runners, with sacks of stock, and they ran among the brokerage houses. Okay, you had a client that sold 1,000, they did this. They got behind starting in about 1968, created something called the paperwork crisis, a Wall Street paperwork crisis. Got so by the early 70s, Wall Street was only open 4 days a week and 5 hours a day or something, because the guys on the bicycles couldn't keep up with the volume. So the SEC and the industry got together and created a new system, which said, okay, all the stock is going to get moved into this corporation you've never heard of, call it the DTCC. And all that's going to trade are entitlements, share IOUs against that stock. So there's about 400 brokers who have, and if you read your brokerage statement carefully, you'll discover this. That fine print that nobody reads, it's in there. And then there's another few thousand brokerages who have relations with those 400. So if you think you own stock, if you're in one of those brokerages, what you really have is a contractual right to your broker, who has a contractual right to another broker, who has a contractual right to the DTCC, who has a contractual right against this company called CD, who actually has the property rights. And my theory that I started putting together 10 or 11 years ago was these daisy chains of property rights, these daisy chains of contractual rights, turn out to have much more slop in them than you would ever imagine. The slop was designed into the system such that it wouldn't vapor lock. There were allowed to be loopholes. There were allowed to be different, so it wouldn't vapor lock if there was a mistake. What happened was the bad guys, and by the late 90s, organized crime, figured out how to use that slop to manipulate the market, to manipulate prices, to rig markets. And just to give you an idea, one of those loopholes the market, the option market maker exemption, and what these mean technically. You can go on Deep Capture and learn about this and so forth. It's called the Madoff exemption, because a guy named Bernie Madoff, when he was the chairman of the SEC, chairman of NASDAQ, went and got the SEC to put one of these loopholes in there that turns out to be big enough. So what started happening by about 15 years ago, and it's incontrovertible, was that slop let people start selling, let the system start selling. If you have an account with, let's say, Merrill Lynch, and you think you have 100 shares of something in it, it may be that they have 100 shares and they're telling 5 different people you own it, that each of them they're saying you own it. So this problem underlies so many of the scandals that you've heard about in the last 6 years. It happened in the stock market, where it's called naked short selling. But philosophically, the same problem was a big part of the mortgage-backed security crisis. Turns out, so if you're 08, the crisis there, they would sell a mortgage-backed security, which just means they take 1,000 mortgages and stuff it into one, like a sausage, stuff it into a sausage and sell that mortgage-backed security. But as the lawyers would do the paperwork and get ready, when that day came to sell it, they might not have had all 1,000 mortgages. And what they would do is they would put in some IOUs and say, well, we'll catch up with the paperwork later and later and later. Well, the American Banking Association, when all this Chernobyl in 08, they came out and said somewhere between 18 and 30% of the stuff in these securities doesn't actually exist, which is why you may have heard about these weird bankruptcy cases in Florida where the guys who owned the bonds were showing up in court trying to foreclose on some homes, and there'd be the foreclosure hearing, and 3 different groups would show up thinking they owned mortgages on the bonds. That's the backstory. That's what was going on. It went on, if you remember, what was the MF Global, MF Finance, the brokers that melted down, and $2 billion of securities had been hypothecated and rehypothecated to London because of this tax arbitrage scheme, and no one could tell anymore who really owned it. US Treasury instruments are rehypothecated on average 3 times, which means for every actual US Treasury bond, there's 3 to 4 insurance companies and pension funds who think they own it. On most days, none of this makes a difference. But when the system comes under stress, it's going to make a big difference.
So this is like the plot of the Mel Brooks movie, The Producers, where they've oversold the production, and it's good as long as the production, you don't actually have to pay off.
You're not just another pretty face, Gillespie.
That's like just what it is. I'm not even that. But, well, here, and maybe we'll end on this note. And yet, you're talking about this deep capture, this dark hypothesis, conspiracy, and at the same time you're incredibly optimistic about the future, and you're talking about blockchain technology as a way around these sorts of problems. Where are the things, blockchain technology, certainly Bitcoin, things like that, peer-to-peer communication that doesn't have a trust problem in it, so it can scale up infinitely. What are the other places that you're optimistic about? You've had serious health issues. Is medical care, are we about to take off in the same way that blockchain technology is? Are we at a positive and optimistic vision of the singularity or something? Do you see unfettered progress, or are we on the precipice?
Well, and just on the healthcare, I'll give you an example, or I'll give you some stats. I've had cancer 3 times. I've had 8 heart surgeries, 29 general surgeries, 106 times put to sleep, and last Tuesday they stopped my heart for the 51st time. Wow. So I've had about 150, 60 times looking for the light. I won't tell you if I saw a light, but I'll tell you I was looking for the light. And I think that healthcare, there are areas it's going to take off if the FDA gets out of the way, and I think 3D printing there's going to be a point not too many years where they can 3D print you a new knee, and maybe be 3D printing you individualized molecules and drugs. And just tying back to the blockchain, the reason I'm such a proponent of the blockchain is it takes all this slop out of these settlement systems. That's on the economic, on the financial problem. It takes, and on the medical, I think if the FDA would get out of the way, and you probably need a way to, how do you deal with a snake oil salesman? But I'm not sure that the FDA has, especially given other means to accomplish the same things that the FDA tries to do, whether they're actually saving more people than they're killing at this point. And I think the big innovations are going to come. 3D printing is huge. They're really within years of being able to print individualized molecules, drugs, take a PET scan or a CAT scan of your hip and 3D print you an individual hip to build it back into your side. So it's remarkable, but my guess is the FDA is at this point probably being counterproductive.
Yeah. All right, well, okay, we've got one more question. Okay, this is it, so make it a good one. The men's room, I just want to tell you, is that way, if that's what you're asking, but, okay, lay it on us, Mr.
Thank
Mike.
you. So a lot of us struggle with the contrasting impulses to sort of be practical in our lives and stick to ideology. You're doing both in a way. I mean, you've got a large and successful company, and you're making certain decisions that could be difficult or put you at some risk, but still hew closer to our ideology. So I just wonder if you could share your thoughts about when's the time to just be practical and go out there and be a success and make money and work on yourself, and versus the times to stick your neck out there and make a stand.
It's a great question, too, and particularly among millennials, and I think we're basically the same age, and I know it sounds like your father, obviously, or your parents worked well. I mean, and successfully. I come from on my Irish side as well as my Italian side on my mother's. I mean, work was drudgery. I mean, you went through it so you had some money to spend on stuff you liked. Among millennials, it seems that there is a rebirth of the idea that your work should be expressive of who you are and of your values and of the world you want to live in. And you really are, I think Mike was right. I mean, you're embodying that. So talk a bit about, is that an inborn thing? How do we cultivate that? And how do you make that, how do you make sure that you don't go too far off in one direction, either where you're just being pragmatic or you're being ideological?
Well, it's funny, Buffett would say I'm probably the last guy in the world you should ask that, because Buffett picks his fights, I don't pick my fights. I fight anyone who wants to fight. Hedge fund, broker, if they're crooks, I just fight them. Teachers union, and it's just my instinct, and he's probably right. It's kind of a defect in my genes, but I get in every fight somebody wants to pick with me. And that's the Irish
Well, maybe
guy.
a 3D printer, they'll be able to fix that gene in a couple of years.
Right.
Yeah.
First of all, when you get out of college, everyone gets out of college and business school wanting to start their own company. You probably don't want to. You want to go, there's a good 5 to 10 year apprenticeship where you have to learn, if you're talking about business, you go learn on somebody else's nickel. It's probably a mistake to get out of school and jump in right away. Learn on someone else's nickel. Also, you probably want to try to put away $10,000 to $25,000 before you get married, because it's very difficult to start saving once you get married. But if you can put aside a nest egg, and this is just, I hear the advice Buffett give young folks, get the nest egg put aside before you get married. Because then when you get married, you live off that income, and you can turn this $20,000, $30,000 savings is what you use to turn into a fortune, if that's what you're after. But I've also heard I've heard a lot of advice from him over the years on this stuff. In terms of sticking your neck out, when you have Buffett says, think of life this way, that you're standing at the plate and somebody's throwing you pitches. And it's a very special baseball game. Best piece of advice he ever gave me. You're standing at the plate, somebody's throwing pitches, and there is no umpire calling balls or strikes. You can stand there for years with a bat on your shoulder. you have to have a temperament that lets you, now there's still a crowd behind you saying, swing you bum, swing you bum. You got to be able to ignore that. And if you do, and a lot of people go through life sort of trying to bunt at every third pitch, but instead you need to have a temperament that says, I'm just going to stand here with a bat on my shoulders for years if I have to. Every once in a while. So somebody throws you a pitch, and it looks great, oh, it's a little bit high and inside, you let it pass. Somebody throws you a pitch, it's a little bit low, but it looks really great, but you decide it's a little bit low, let it pass. Nobody's calling strikes. But every once in a while, every few years, someone's going to throw you a pitch that looks like the fattest pitch you're ever going to see. And when that happens, come out of your shoes on it. You come out, you swing for the fences on it. And that's probably where Buffett and I actually share a gene. So that would be my advice. If you, and I'll actually close on some great advice my dad gave me. I was kind of hospitalized. I spent 3 years in the hospital. Was an invalid all through my 20s. And I started really feeling, so that's why I ended up as a student all this time, because I was in and out of the hospital and there was not much else to do. And Stanford was wonderful to me. They let me do much of the PhD from a hospital bed. And they, incidentally, what I started studying off there was mathematical logic, which included computation theory, which is the math that underlies cryptology, which is why when Bitcoin came along, I said, oh, this is that stuff I recognized right away, what it was based on and why I got so into it. But my pop told me, you know, there's really no, my father, he got out of the Air Force, he played poker, he was a scratch handicap golfer, he was a golf hustler, kind of was that, you know, typical Irish guy, till he was about 30. And then he started getting serious about life. His father was a lifeguard till he was 36, and then ended up being an insurance agent. So, but my pop, when I asked him that, and my father died 2 years ago this week, which is why he's on my mind, I guess. He said, people worry too much about that. Float around, try different things, and when you find the right thing, you just start digging at it, and it doesn't feel like work. It really doesn't even feel like work. And if you wake up someday and you're 35 and you haven't figured out what it is you want to be when you grow up, then you start having a problem. But Patrick, don't worry about it. Just keep floating around, try different things. I took different jobs. I was in and out of academia. I would go and work on this kind, and I got paid. I had a pretty modest existence, but it was enough to live on. I tried being a boxer. I was writing my dissertation. I was fighting with the Gracies. I got a scholarship here and there that let me and I was just recovering until I was about 30. And he was right. I came back to New Hampshire and went to work in a torch company in Lebanon, New Hampshire, that made industrial plasma torches. And I had led anyway, I won't tell you how I got involved, but when I found that thing, gosh, I was in at 7 in the morning and working to midnight, and I had found the most intriguing thing in the world to me. It didn't even feel like a job, and it worked out just like and when you find that thing, you just hammer it all the way to heaven, and it doesn't even feel like work. As Buffett says, I tap dance to work. Buffett's 83, and he says, I tap dance to work every day. When you find that, don't fret. Young guy, how old are you? Don't fret too much. If you wake up and you're 35 and you're still wondering what to be someday, maybe you got to, listen to somebody else. But just follow what your heart is behind. Actually, can I give one more piece of Buffett advice?
I think you can.
This is a great piece of advice. I heard Buffett asked once by a school teacher a question in an audience, something like this. And the guy stood up and said, I'm a history teacher at a local high school. I make a nice middle-class income, and I'm comfortable. But all the folks I went to college with, they went on to law school, and now they're out there, and they're making, they're lawyers, and they're this and that. They're making 4 times what I make. And Buffett said, and the guy said, I'm thinking of leaving being a high school history teacher to go do this other stuff. And Buffett said, let me tell you about my life. I wake up in the morning, I have my, frosted flare. He doesn't even eat anything that healthy. He eats like, the craziest sugary stuff. And he says, you have yours, they taste the same to each other. I read the paper, you read your paper. They read the same. you put on your clothes, I put on my clothes from JCPenney, yours probably fit better than mine do. Most of our life is that, as long as you've made it into the middle class, and of course it's easy for, guys like me or brother to say, but if you can make it into the middle class, and there's all this psychological evidence that shows really your happiness increases with income up to about $50,000 a year in household income, and at $70,000, it basically plateaus. There's a slight increase from $70,000 household income to 110 or something, and then it's like, it just goes flat. And he said, so we do all these things, and 85% of our lives we experience the same way. There's one thing, I travel a lot better than you do. Other than that, so why would you give up something you love doing, like being a high school history teacher, in order to do some crappy job being a corporate lawyer that you're gonna, smell like BO and eat stale ham sandwiches, and you're gonna hate your life trying to improve that little 15%. It actually doesn't, scientifically, by the data, people don't get happier past about a $70,000 household income. So you want to pursue what actually you dig rather than trying to run that number up.
Well, thank you so much, Patrick, for your time and your insights. This has been great, really wonderful. And I love, with the batting cage, or the batting thing, that's like Zen in the art of the batting practice or something.
Right.
It's really a wonderful way to think about things. So on behalf of Liberty Forum, thank you so much, and thank you to all of you for listening.
Thank you, Nick.